Samantha Walker had always been drawn to the past. A historian by training, she spent her days buried in dusty archives, sifting through long-forgotten documents and ancient texts. Yet, nothing had ever fascinated her as much as the cultures of Africa, particularly the Akan people of West Africa. Their art, their customs, and the stories of their empires intrigued her. But it was the Ashanti kingdom that held her captive. The Ashanti Empire, a once powerful kingdom in what is now modern-day Ghana, had fascinated scholars for centuries. Its wealth, its military prowess, and its rich traditions had once shaken the foundations of West Africa. But what drew Samantha in was something far more elusive: a legend. A legend about the Golden Stool, an artifact that symbolized the unity and power of the Ashanti people. And more than that, it was said to be cursed. Curse. Samantha scoffed at the idea when she first heard it. Her logical, academic mind rejected the supernatural as nothing more than superstition. But the more she read, the more she felt the story tug at her. There was something about the Ashanti people, their belief in the power of ancestors, their connection to the spiritual world, that felt real. And the curse? It wasn't just a story, it was part of their history. The opportunity to visit Ghana and study the remnants of the Ashanti Empire came unexpectedly, through a grant from her university. It was a dream come true. With her bags packed and a sense of both excitement and unease, she boarded the plane, eager to uncover the truth behind the stories. What she didn't know was that this journey would take her far beyond the realm of history into a world where the past and present merged, where spirits still lingered, and where a curse would soon begin to take hold of her life. Ghana greeted her with a warmth that matched the sun. But it was Kumasi, the ancient capital of the Ashanti kingdom, that called to her. The city, alive with the hum of markets and the buzz of history, seemed to pulse with an energy all its own. She met her guide, Kofi Mensah, a local man whose deep connection to the land and its history was clear from the moment they shook hands. Kofi's family, he explained, had served the Ashanti kings for generations, and the stories of his ancestors were woven into the fabric of the city itself. It was during a visit to the Manhaya Palace that the first chill ran down her spine. The Grand Palace, now a museum, stood as a testament to the Ashanti Empire's former glory. Yet, Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, something ancient and powerful. As she wandered through the rooms, her eyes fell upon a replica of the Golden Stool, the symbol of the Ashanti monarchy, perched in a place of honor. Its presence was overwhelming. Kofi had warned her about the stool. Its power was not to be underestimated. The stool, he explained, was not just an object. It was sacred. As they stood in silence before the stool, Kofi spoke again, his voice low and filled with a reverence that Samantha hadn't expected. "The curse of the stool," he murmured, "is not just a myth. It is the reason the Ashanti kingdom fell. And it is the reason you have come." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. She had heard of the curse before, of course, but she had never thought it to be more than a metaphor for the kingdom's downfall. Now, as she stood there in the shadow of the Golden Stool, she could feel its weight. The air around them seemed to thicken, and a whisper in the wind seemed to carry the words of ancient kings, long dead but never truly gone. "Why are you here?" Kofi asked, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her uneasy. "The ancestors have called you." Samantha blinked, unsure of what to make of his words. "I'm here to study history," she replied, her voice faltering slightly. "No," Kofi said, his tone unshakable. "You are here because the spirits of the Ashanti want you to learn their truth. And the truth is not what you think it is." Samantha's mind raced. She was a historian, a scholar, not a believer in curses or spirits. But in the days that followed, she would come to realize that the lines between history and myth were far more blurred than she had ever imagined. The Golden Stool was more than a symbol of power. It was the heart of the Ashanti people, and it held within it a darkness that had waited centuries to be awakened. As the days passed and the shadows grew longer, Samantha's journey would take her far deeper than she had ever anticipated, into a world where the past spoke louder than the present, and the curse of the Ashanti throne beckoned to those who dared to seek it. Arrival in Ghana. Samantha Walker's flight from New York to Accra had been long, but it gave her plenty of time to think, to review her notes and prepare for the fieldwork she'd long dreamed of. As an academic, she had spent years poring over research about the Ashanti Empire, its rise, its golden stool, its decline, and above all, its myths. Of all the African cultures she had studied, the Akan people, and specifically the Ashanti, had captured her imagination the most. They had been the dominant kingdom in West Africa for centuries, until their eventual fall at the hands of the British colonizers. Their legends, however, seemed to have outlasted their empire. She knew the story of the Golden Stool, a sacred artifact said to be the spiritual heart of the Ashanti people, believed to be inhabited by the spirits of their ancestors. But beyond the mythology was something more, a curse, they said. A curse that struck down anyone who dared claim the throne of the Ashanti without the true bloodline. And, as the legend went, the stool was not just a symbol of power, it was the repository of the kingdom's soul. To disturb it, to misuse it, was to invite ruin. It was a topic of intense fascination for scholars. And yet, most were too afraid to truly delve into the heart of the myth. Her arrival at Kotoka International Airport was a welcome change from the coldness of the New York winter. The heat of Accra hit her like a wall as she stepped out of the plane, her body absorbing the humid air that enveloped her instantly. The unfamiliar sounds, the rush of energy that was Accra, filled her senses as soon as she stepped onto the tarmac. But it was the thought of Kumasi, the heart of the Ashanti Empire, that kept her excited and anxious in equal measure. She was met by a driver who took her directly to a small hotel in Accra. After a brief rest, she spent the evening reviewing her itinerary, but the excitement of the trip kept her awake. The next day, she was set to travel to Kumasi, where she would begin her research in earnest. Kofi Mensah, her guide and local historian, had arranged her accommodations and would be accompanying her to important sites. Kofi had told her over email that his family's ties to the Ashanti royal lineage went back centuries. His grandfather had served as a priest to the royal family, a custodian of sacred traditions. He was a man of few words, but there was a palpable sense of pride in his voice when he spoke about his heritage. There was something else about Kofi that intrigued Samantha, an unspoken understanding, an air of reverence, as if he carried within him the weight of centuries of Ashanti history. She had expected the excitement to be academic in nature, but she could not shake the feeling that something deeper, something far more mysterious, awaited her in Kumasi. Journey to Kumasi. The journey to Kumasi was long, taking nearly 5 hours by road. The landscape changed as they left the bustling city of Accra behind. Replaced by rolling hills and expansive forests, Samantha looked out the window, watching the countryside unfold before her. It was a world so different from the one she had left behind in the United States, one rich with history and mystery. The further they drove, the more she felt the weight of the land pressing in on her. Upon arrival, Kofi took her directly to the Manhaya Palace, the former seat of the Ashanti kings. The palace was now a museum, but its presence still loomed large over the city. It was a sprawling complex, its walls adorned with intricate wood carvings that depicted stories from the Ashanti's glorious past. Samantha stood before it, feeling the weight of history press against her chest. Inside the palace, she marveled at the artifacts on display: ceremonial swords, elaborate gold jewelry, and the famous Golden Stool. The stool was not displayed in its original form but rather a replica. Yet, as Samantha gazed at it, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more than simple history here. The stool seemed to hum with a presence she couldn't understand. Its beauty was undeniable: gilded wood, delicate carvings, and an intricate design that captured the essence of the Ashanti kingdom. Kofi had warned her about the stool before they arrived. The stool is sacred. It is more than a symbol. he had said. It is the spirit of the Ashanti people, their strength, their unity, and their will. It is said that to touch it without the proper bloodline is to invite destruction. Samantha had dismissed it as legend, stories to keep the stool protected. But as she stood before the replica in the quiet hall of the palace, her academic mind told her there was more to it than myth. The ceremony and the first signs. Later that evening, Kofi invited Samantha to attend a private ceremony at a nearby temple. It was not a tourist attraction but a local ritual that had been passed down through generations. Kofi explained that this ceremony honored the ancestors of the Ashanti people, ensuring their spirits would continue to guide the living. The temple was simple, built of stone and wood, but inside it was filled with an intense energy. The air seemed thick with incense, and the sound of drums filled the air, resonating deep in Samantha's chest. There were only a handful of people present, but their presence seemed to transcend the physical space. They were dressed in ceremonial attire, their faces painted with ritual markings. The leader of the ceremony, an elderly man named Okamfo Kojo, welcomed them and immediately began a chant in the Ashanti language. Kofi explained that Okamfo Kojo was the high priest of the Ashanti people, someone who could communicate directly with the spirits of their ancestors. As the ceremony continued, Samantha felt a sense of unease growing in her. It was not the sound of the drums or the rhythmic chanting that disturbed her. It was the feeling of being watched, of being drawn into something much larger than herself. It was as if the very air around her had shifted. Her mind raced, but her academic training kept her from giving in to superstition. And then, during the deepest part of the ritual, something strange happened. Samantha began to see flashes of images, brief and fleeting. She saw ancient warriors, their faces painted with ash, standing on the battlefield. She saw a throne, a golden stool, surrounded by flickering flames. And in the distance, there was a figure, a king, his face obscured by shadows, his eyes filled with sorrow. He reached out, but the vision vanished before she could understand it. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she gripped the edge of the bench she was sitting on. "Are you all right?" Kofi asked, his voice a whisper in the darkened room. I don't know," Samantha stammered. "I saw something, a vision." Kofi's eyes softened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something ancient in his gaze. "The ancestors speak to us in many ways, Samantha. Sometimes they show us what we are meant to learn, what we are meant to understand. Do not be afraid." But Samantha could not shake the feeling that something had just begun to awaken. A presence, a power that had remained dormant for centuries, waiting for the right person to come and disturb its peace. A night of restless dreams. That night, Samantha lay in her hotel room, the feeling of the ceremony still hanging heavy in the air. Her mind refused to rest, and the images from the ritual continued to haunt her dreams. She dreamt of the Ashanti kings, their faces shrouded in mystery, their voices whispering in a language she could not understand. The golden stool appeared again, but this time it was not just a throne, it was alive, pulsing with energy, its power seeping into her veins. She woke with a start, drenched in sweat, her heart racing. It took her a moment to realize where she was, but the unease remained. The curse of the golden stool. She had heard of it before, but now it felt real, too real. In the silence of the room, she could hear the distant hum of the city, the faint beat of drums in the night. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting, unraveling the mysteries of the past. The days following the ceremony passed in a blur. Samantha spent her mornings in the quiet halls of the Manhaya Palace Museum, poring over ancient texts and artifacts. The more she learned about the Ashanti, the more captivated she became by their world. She discovered the beauty of their art, the wisdom embedded in their proverbs, and the intricacies of their spiritual beliefs. Yet, no matter how much she read, there was always a sense that she was only scratching the surface. It was as though the true knowledge, the deep truths of the Ashanti, remained just out of reach. Kofi accompanied her to the Kamfo Anakai sword site, where legend had it that Kamfo Anakai, a high priest, had planted a sword in the ground to signify the beginning of the Ashanti kingdom. According to the legend, the sword would not move, signifying the unbreakable unity of the Ashanti people. As they stood in the quiet, sacred space, Kofi explained the importance of Kamfo Anakai in Ashanti history. It was said that he had not only founded the kingdom but had also been the one to place the curse on the Golden Stool, ensuring that the throne would remain protected from anyone unworthy. "It is not just an artifact, Samantha," Kofi said, his voice grave as he led her to the site. "The stool is a living thing. It holds the spirits of the Ashanti kings. It was the symbol of their unity, their strength. And when they betrayed it, when they broke the sacred oath, the curse was born." Samantha listened carefully, but her mind wandered. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. But there were still so many questions. She had spent years studying the Ashanti Empire, but she had never encountered such a powerful connection between the living and the dead. The curse was not merely a consequence of betrayal, it was a force in its own right, something that lived, that breathed, that could change the course of history. That evening, they visited an Okamfo, a spiritual priest, named Kojo. The elderly man, dressed in traditional garments of white and gold, sat before them in a small, dimly lit room filled with incense. His eyes were sharp, his gaze penetrating, as if he could see beyond the physical realm. He welcomed them with a slight bow, a deep respect for his role as the guardian of the Ashanti spiritual world. "The stool is sacred," Okamfo Kojo began, his voice steady and ancient. "It holds the power of the ancestors. Those who seek to claim the throne must first prove themselves worthy. And if they do not, they will be consumed by the curse. But the curse is not just a punishment, it is a protection. The stool must not fall into the wrong hands." Samantha asked him about the curse, her voice trembling with the questions that had been growing inside her. What happened to the last person who touched the stool without the proper bloodline? Okamfo Kojo's eyes darkened. He paused for a moment before speaking, as if weighing his words carefully. The last person who tried to claim the stool was a man named Nana Badu. He was a royal cousin, but he lacked the blood of the true kings. His ambition drove him to take what he did not deserve. The stool rejected him, and in the days that followed, his mind began to unravel. He heard voices, saw things that were not there. It was as if the stool itself was pulling him into the realm of the ancestors. Samantha listened intently, her heart racing. "What happened to him?" "He died," Kojo said softly. "But his death was not peaceful. He was found in the jungle, speaking in tongues, his body twisted in ways that no man should be. His family claimed he had been possessed by the spirits of the past, the ancestors themselves. Some say he was cursed to wander the earth for eternity, trapped between the worlds of the living and the dead." Samantha shuddered. She had read about the dangers of disturbing sacred objects in her academic studies. But this felt different, more tangible, more real. There was a deep power in the stool, a power that no one could truly understand unless they were a part of it. But what did it mean for her? Was she destined to become entangled in this curse as well? A visit to the Golden Stool's resting place. The following morning, Kofi took Samantha to a hidden location deep in the jungle, a place known only to the descendants of the Ashanti royal family. It was said that this was where the original Golden Stool had been hidden for safekeeping, its power too great to be left in the open. The journey to the shrine was long and treacherous. They passed through thick forest, the path barely visible beneath their feet, and the air growing thick with humidity. Samantha felt the weight of the jungle closing in on her, the feeling that something was watching her from the shadows. It was as if the land itself was alive, a living entity that had witnessed centuries of history. When they finally reached the shrine, Samantha was overwhelmed by its power. The shrine was not a grand building, but rather a secluded grove of trees. Their roots twisted and knotted into the earth like ancient serpents. In the center of the grove was a large stone altar, surrounded by offerings of fruit, flowers, and incense. Atop the altar was a replica of the Golden Stool, glowing faintly in the dappled sunlight. "This is where it all began," Kofi said, his voice reverent. "This is the heart of the Ashanti people. The Golden Stool was once here, before it was moved to the palace. It is said that the stool has the power to decide the fate of anyone who seeks the throne, and it will not tolerate a false ruler." Samantha approached the altar slowly, drawn to the stool's presence. She could feel the energy radiating from it, a force that seemed to hum in the air. She reached out a hand, but before she could touch it, Kofi stopped her. "Do not touch it, Samantha," he warned. "The stool is not to be taken lightly. It is a symbol of the power of the Ashanti, and it must be respected." Samantha withdrew her hand, but the urge to understand, to uncover the truth, burned inside her. The Golden Stool was more than just a relic. It was a living entity, a vessel that carried the souls of the Ashanti ancestors. And it was clear to her now that the curse, the spirit of the stool, was not something to be ignored. "Why did they hide it here?" Samantha asked. "Why not keep it in the palace, where it could be protected?" "Because it is too powerful," Kofi said quietly. "The stool holds the power of the kings, but it also holds their mistakes. It is a reminder of what happens when power is abused. The Ashanti were once a mighty kingdom, but they were betrayed. The stool can never be in the hands of the unworthy." Samantha stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of history pressing down on her. She realized that she had come to Ghana to study the Ashanti Empire, but she had found herself drawn into something far more complex. The curse of the Golden Stool was not just a story, it was a warning. And now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Samantha knew she had to uncover the truth before it was too late. Visions of the past. That night, as Samantha lay in bed, the visions returned. The shadows of the past haunted her dreams. Warriors in gold, the sound of drums reverberating through her mind, and the unmistakable figure of a king. She saw the stool once again, but this time it was not glowing with golden light. Instead, it was shrouded in darkness, the surface cracked and worn, as if it had been abandoned for centuries. The king in her dream reached out for it, but as his fingers touched the stool, a wave of darkness enveloped him. He cried out in agony, his body contorting in unnatural ways as the curse took hold. Samantha woke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. She was drenched in sweat, the images of the dream lingering in her mind like ghosts. The curse of the Golden Stool was not just a myth, it was real, and it was beginning to consume her. As she sat up in bed, she felt an overwhelming sense of urgency. She had to uncover the truth. She had to understand what had happened to the Ashanti, to the stool, and to the man who had been consumed by its power. But as the wind howled outside her window, she knew that the answers she sought would not come easily, and the deeper she dug, the more she feared what she might uncover. Samantha could no longer escape the feeling that she was being drawn into a web she didn't fully understand, one woven from ancient threads of power and forgotten promises. Every step she took, every piece of history she uncovered, seemed to pull her deeper into the darkness that surrounded the Golden Stool. It was as if the stool itself was calling to her, urging her to discover its secrets, but also warning her that to seek those secrets came at a price. The days after her visit to the shrine passed uneasily. Although she continued her research in the local archives and spent time speaking with Kofi and other members of the local community, the quiet unease that had settled in her chest never left. The images from her dreams haunted her, visions of Ashanti kings, the deep resonance of war drums, and the overwhelming presence of the Golden Stool. She couldn't shake the feeling that the stool was more than just a symbol of power. It was a vessel for something far more powerful and far more dangerous than anything she had anticipated. One evening, Kofi took Samantha to the outskirts of Kumasi, where an old Ashanti woman, Santua lived. She was a healer, one of the few who still practiced ancient spiritual rites. Samantha had heard whispers of her name among the locals, spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear. Santua was known for her deep knowledge of Ashanti history, but she was also rumored to be a guardian of the ancient ways, a keeper of forbidden knowledge. Kofi warned Samantha that Santua's powers were not something to be taken lightly. "She is not a woman to be trifled with," he said, his voice low. "She speaks of things that no one should know. You must listen to her carefully, but do not provoke her." Samantha wasn't sure what to expect. When they arrived at the small compound, it was nestled in a dense thicket of trees, far from the busy streets of Kumasi. The air was thick with the scent of burning herbs and incense, and the atmosphere felt charged, as if the land itself was alive with spiritual energy. Santua stood at the entrance, her figure tall and commanding despite her age. Her long, gray hair was tied back with a simple cloth, and her eyes gleamed with the kind of wisdom that comes from having lived through centuries of history. "Come, child." Santua greeted them, her voice surprisingly strong for someone so elderly. "The ancestors have called for you." Samantha felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't the first time someone had told her that the ancestors had summoned her, but now, standing before this woman, the words took on an ominous weight. She followed Kofi and Santua into a small, dimly lit hut where a fire burned in the center, filling the space with an eerie warmth. The walls were adorned with symbols of the Ashanti, carved wooden figures, and ceremonial masks. There was a palpable sense of history in the room, as if the spirits of the past were watching. Santua motioned for Samantha to sit, and without a word, she began to chant in a language Samantha couldn't understand. The air thickened with energy, and Samantha felt her pulse quicken. It was as though the entire room was vibrating with the weight of ancient knowledge. After several minutes, Santua stopped her chant and fixed her gaze on Samantha. "You are here for the stool," she said, her voice now softer, more knowing. Samantha swallowed. "I don't know if I'm here for the stool," she replied, her voice unsure. "I'm just trying to understand its history, to learn." The old woman shook her head slowly, her eyes narrowing. "The stool has a history, yes, but its true history is not something you can learn in books or archives. It is a living thing, and it remembers. It remembers the blood that has been spilled for it, the sacrifices made in its name." Samantha was taken aback. "What do you mean? What sacrifices?" Santua's face hardened, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "The Ashanti kingdom was built on blood, on the blood of kings, of warriors, and of those who betrayed them. The stool was meant to protect the Ashanti, but it became a weapon. Those who were unworthy were cursed to suffer, their minds twisted by the power of the stool. The curse is not just a punishment, it is a test to see who is worthy of holding the power." Samantha felt the weight of Santua's words settle over her. "But I'm not here to take the stool," she protested. "I'm just studying it, learning its history." The old woman looked at her, her gaze piercing. "The stool calls to you, just as it calls to anyone who is meant to understand its true power. And now, the stool is stirring again, because someone who is not worthy seeks it. You are a part of that story, whether you wish it or not." Samantha's breath caught in her throat. The curse was real. It wasn't just a legend. And now, it seemed, she was part of the curse's unfolding. The curse takes hold. As days passed, Samantha began to experience the effects of the curse more intensely. At first, it was subtle, strange dreams that felt too real, whispers in the corners of her mind, fleeting glimpses of the past. But soon, it became undeniable. She started hearing voices that weren't her own, voices that spoke in a language she didn't understand. She would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, unable to shake the feeling that she was being watched by unseen eyes. Kofi noticed the change in her as well. At first, he was concerned, offering her prayers and blessings. But the more Samantha tried to push away the feeling, the stronger it became. The spirits of the Ashanti ancestors seemed to have marked her, drawing her further into their world. One evening, while she was alone in her room, the full force of the curse hit her. The shadows in the room seemed to shift, the air growing heavy and oppressive. She felt as though the very walls were closing in on her, and the voices grew louder, clearer. They were the voices of ancient Ashanti kings, their words filled with both anger and sorrow. Samantha couldn't understand them, but she could feel their pain, the weight of centuries of betrayal and broken promises. She stumbled out of her room, her heart racing, and made her way outside. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie light over the land. As she walked through the grounds of the hotel, she felt the presence of someone, following her. The whispers grew louder, and then she heard a voice, clear and unmistakable. "The stool is not just a throne," the voice said. "It is a promise that was broken." Samantha stopped dead in her tracks, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. But there was no answer, only the silence of the night. The next day, Kofi found her shaken and exhausted. "You must stop, Samantha," he said gently. "The stool has already claimed you. The curse has begun to work its will." Samantha shook her head, her thoughts racing. "I don't understand. What does it want from me?" Kofi looked at her with a mixture of pity and concern. "The stool does not want anything from you. It simply tests you. And now, you must face what it demands." Her heart pounded in her chest. What was it demanding? Was she supposed to become part of the Ashanti royal lineage? Or was she simply a pawn in a game played by the ancient forces that had long since lost their power? That night, as she lay in bed, the dreams returned. But this time, they were different. They were vivid, more real than ever before. She saw the golden stool, its surface gleaming with an unnatural light. She saw a figure standing before it, a king, his face obscured by shadows. He reached out for the stool, and as his fingers brushed its surface, the curse erupted. The man's body twisted and writhed as if he were being consumed by the very power of the stool. His eyes locked with hers, pleading for release. But the curse had already claimed him. And then, he whispered a single word, "Help!" Samantha woke with a start, gasping for breath, her heart racing. She knew now that the curse was not just a warning, it was a call to action. And she was the one who had to answer it. The days had become harder to differentiate. Time seemed to lose its meaning as the curse tightened its grip on Samantha, pulling her deeper into its dark embrace. She had come to Ghana with a desire to uncover history, to understand the ancient roots of the Ashanti kingdom. But now, the line between history and myth had blurred beyond recognition. The past, once distant and academic, had become her present, and the curse of the Golden Stool was no longer a legend, it was a living nightmare. The voices came more frequently now, filling her thoughts until they were all she could hear. The Ashanti kings, their whispers cold and commanding, spoke of betrayal, of bloodshed, of the moment when the Golden Stool was cursed by the ancestors to protect the royal lineage. Their words twisted in her mind, refusing to release her from their grasp. The dreams were worse, too. The visions of the stool, glowing with an unnatural light, haunted her waking hours as well. Every reflection, every shadow seemed to shift and take on the form of the cursed throne. It was as though the very land around her, the air she breathed, carried the weight of the curse, and she could not escape it. Kofi had grown increasingly concerned. He had tried to help her, offering her prayers and seeking guidance from the elders. But nothing seemed to quiet the growing storm inside her. Samantha no longer slept through the night. Her mind raced, spinning between the visions of the past and the voices that refused to be ignored. She no longer trusted her own thoughts, let alone the truth of what was real and what was imagined. One evening, as she sat in her small hotel room, the walls seemed to close in on her. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening. until she could no longer differentiate them from her own thoughts. She tried to block them out, but it was impossible. The curse had claimed her mind, just as it had claimed those who came before her. She could feel herself slipping, her grip on reality loosening with every passing second. Her reflection in the window was no longer her own. The face staring back at her was unfamiliar, twisted with fear and despair. The eyes, once clear and sharp, now seemed hollow, as if they were empty vessels, haunted by the spirits of the past. Samantha reached out, touching the glass, hoping that somehow she could break free from the oppressive weight of the curse. But the image in the window reached back, its fingers pressing against the glass in a twisted imitation of her own. In that moment, she knew she could not escape. The curse had taken root inside her, and there was no turning back. The unraveling. Kofi found her later that evening, sitting in the corner of her room, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, as if she had not slept in days. He approached cautiously, his hand outstretched in an attempt to comfort her. But Samantha recoiled, her breath shallow and quick. "The voices, they won't stop," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're inside my head, Kofi. They're telling me things I don't understand. But I know they're true." Kofi sat beside her, his expression solemn. He had seen this before, though not in someone so young, someone so determined to resist. He knew that the curse had found its victim, and once it claimed someone, it would not let go until it had consumed them completely. The stool's power was ancient, and it had no mercy. "You have to fight it, Samantha," Kofi urged. "The stool, it's not just an object. It's a test, a trial. The ancestors are watching, waiting to see if you can withstand its pull. But you cannot let it control you." Samantha shook her head violently. "It's too late," she muttered, her eyes unfocused. "I can feel it inside me. It's already too late." Her words struck Kofi like a blow. He had hoped to help her, to show her the way back to sanity. But now he feared that it was beyond his reach. He had known the power of the stool for his entire life, but he had never seen anyone so deeply affected by it. The curse had a way of bending minds, distorting reality, and once it had fully taken hold, there was no way to reverse its effects. Kofi reached into his bag and pulled out a small, wooden charm. It was an ancient symbol of protection, something passed down through generations of his family. He had hoped to never use it, but now he knew there was no other choice. "Take this," he said, placing the charm in Samantha's hand. "It's an offering to the ancestors. It may not stop the curse, but it will help shield your spirit from its power." Samantha stared at the charm, her hand trembling as she held it. She wanted to believe it would help, but deep down, she knew it would not be enough. The stool was too powerful, and her connection to it was too strong. She had been chosen by the spirits of the Ashanti kings, and now, it seemed, there was no escape, a journey into the past, in a last-ditch effort to free herself from the curse. Samantha turned to the only place she hadn't yet explored, the ancient texts hidden deep in the archives of Kumasi. She had read the books, studied the manuscripts, but there was something in the very oldest scrolls, tucked away in a forgotten corner, that might hold the key to understanding the curse and breaking it. She arrived at the archive early the next morning, her body still exhausted from days without sleep. Her mind felt foggy, disjointed, but there was a sense of urgency driving her forward. She needed to find the answers before the curse consumed her entirely. The archives were quiet, the air heavy with dust and age. The librarian, a man named Nana, nodded in greeting as Samantha entered. He had seen her countless times before, but today, there was something different in her eyes, something distant, as though she were no longer entirely present in the world of the living. "I need to see the oldest texts," she said, her voice hoarse, "the ones no one ever touches." Nana hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Those texts are not for the uninitiated," he warned. "They are dangerous." Samantha, they hold the darkest secrets of the Ashanti, and once you begin to read them, you may not be able to stop. I don't care, Samantha replied, her voice steady but urgent. I need to know the truth. Reluctantly, Nana led her to a back room, where a large wooden chest stood in the center. He opened it slowly, revealing a collection of scrolls wrapped in tattered cloth. Samantha could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her as she stepped closer, her hand reaching for the first scroll. The moment her fingers touched it, a jolt of energy shot through her body, and for a split second, she saw flashes of ancient Ashanti kings, their faces filled with anguish and anger. She unwrapped the scroll, the faded ink revealing the story of the Golden Stool's creation and the curse that followed. The curse, it seemed, had not been the result of a single betrayal, but a collective failure of the Ashanti people, a moment when the kingdom had become too powerful, too arrogant, and had turned its back on the ancestors who had granted them that power. The stool, once a symbol of unity, had been twisted into a weapon, and in that moment, it had been cursed to forever protect the Ashanti throne from those unworthy to claim it. But there was more. The curse had not just been placed on the stool. It had been placed on the entire royal bloodline. The descendants of those who had betrayed the stool were marked by the spirits of the ancestors, forever doomed to bear the weight of the kingdom's sins. Samantha's heart raced as the truth unfolded before her. The curse was not just a punishment, it was a burden, a cycle that had to be broken. But how? How could she undo something that had been set in motion centuries ago? As the last lines of the scroll faded from her vision, a voice whispered in her ear, cold and unmistakable. You have seen the truth, it said. But now, you must decide, will you break the cycle? Or will you join the kings who failed before you? The room spun, and Samantha's knees buckled beneath her. The voices of the ancestors filled her mind, their rage and sorrow washing over her like a tidal wave. The curse had not only claimed her body, it had claimed her soul. She looked down at the scroll in her hands, the weight of the choice she had to make pressing down on her shoulders. There was no escaping it now. She had been pulled into the web of the past, and only by understanding the full depth of the curse could she hope to survive. But at what cost? Samantha's heart thudded in her chest, the weight of the ancient scrolls in her hands almost unbearable. She could feel the spirits of the Ashanti ancestors pressing down on her, urging her to make a choice. The room around her seemed to close in, the air thick with the weight of centuries of history, betrayal, and the consequences of those who had come before her. The Golden Stool, its power now unmistakably a part of her very soul, called to her, a silent force she could no longer deny. The voice had spoken clearly. You have seen the truth. Now, you must decide, will you break the cycle? Or will you join the kings who failed before you? The weight of the question was overwhelming. It was more than just about the stool. It was about everything: the Ashanti people, their royal bloodline, the mistakes of their ancestors, and the deep, inescapable curse that had bound them all. She realized now that the curse had not only been cast upon the throne but had infected every generation of Ashanti leaders. An eternal cycle of betrayal, ambition, and bloodshed that could only end with one of two fates: breaking the cycle or perpetuating it for another generation. Samantha's mind reeled as she grasped the full significance of what she had uncovered. She wasn't merely an observer in this history. She was a part of it now. The ancestors had drawn her in, and she could feel the power of the Golden Stool coursing through her veins, urging her to make her choice. She turned to Kofi, who had been standing quietly in the doorway, his eyes filled with concern. His face was etched with sadness, the weight of his own lineage pressing down on him. I've learned the truth, Samantha whispered, her voice shaky. The curse isn't just about the stool. It's about us, Kofi. It's about the bloodline. The stool wasn't just an object. It was a promise, a betrayal, and a test. Kofi nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. I've known this my whole life, he said softly. It is why I never pursued the throne. Why my family stayed hidden from the politics of the royal court. We knew the cost of the curse. But you've been chosen to break it. Samantha could barely hold his gaze. But can it even be broken? The curse has survived for centuries. Can anyone really escape its grip? He took a step forward, his hand reaching out to touch her shoulder gently. There are always those who rise above it. Samantha, the stool itself is a test. Only someone pure in heart, someone with the courage to face the past, can break it, but it will demand everything from you. The truth was clear now, more than ever. Samantha had come to Ghana seeking to study the Ashanti kingdom, to piece together a history she had only read about in books. But what she had discovered was something far darker, far more intimate than any academic pursuit. The curse had chosen her, drawn her into a world where the past never truly let go. It demanded a sacrifice. She glanced down at the small wooden charm Kofi had given her, still clutched tightly in her hand. It had been meant to protect her, to shield her from the curse's power. But protection was no longer enough. Samantha knew that the time had come for a choice. I can't run from this anymore, she said quietly, almost to herself. I have to end it. Kofi nodded, his eyes filled with both pride and sorrow. You are stronger than you realize, Samantha, but the stool will not let you go easily. It will take everything you have. The final confrontation. Samantha's decision was made. She had to go to the place where it all began, the site of the Golden Stool's resting place. She had already visited the shrine deep in the jungle, but now she understood its true meaning. It wasn't just a relic. It was a living part of the Ashanti legacy, and she had to confront it directly, face to face. Kofi led her there, through the thick, tangled jungle paths, the air heavy with humidity and the distant sounds of wildlife. It seemed like the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for what was to come. When they arrived at the shrine, it was as she had remembered it, quiet, serene, yet alive with the weight of history. The ancient trees that surrounded the stone altar seemed to whisper in the wind, as if they too remembered the past. In the center of the altar lay the golden stool, resting in peaceful silence. But Samantha could feel its presence, its power, vibrating in the air around her. The stool was not just an object. It was a force, a symbol of everything the Ashanti had been, and everything they had lost. Samantha approached the stool slowly, her heart racing. She knew what she had to do, but the weight of the decision threatened to crush her. The stool's golden surface gleamed in the dappled light, but there was something different about it now. It wasn't just beautiful, it was ancient, filled with the memories of a kingdom long gone, of kings who had fallen victim to their own ambition. She took a deep breath and knelt before it. For a moment, everything was silent. The voices in her mind, the whispers of the ancestors, faded away. The curse, it seemed, was waiting, watching, allowing her the space to act. Kofi stepped forward, standing by her side, his presence a quiet reassurance. This is it, Samantha, he said softly. This is the moment that will decide the future. The stool will only accept the worthy. If you are not ready, it will claim you as it has claimed others. She nodded, her resolve hardening. This was her destiny, whether she had chosen it or not. The stool had already chosen her. She was the one who could break the cycle, the one who could end the curse. With trembling hands, she reached out and touched the golden stool. The world seemed to shift around her. The jungle, the shrine, Kofi, all of it faded into the background. And in its place, she was transported to another time. She saw the Ashanti kings, their faces full of pride and sorrow, their hands touching the stool in moments of power and weakness. She saw the moment the curse was born, the betrayal, the greed, the ambition that twisted the stool from a symbol of unity into a vessel of destruction. And then, she saw the final truth. The curse could only be broken through forgiveness, not just of the Ashanti kings, but of herself. The stool had always been a test of character, of the ability to let go of the past and forge a new future. To break the curse, she had to forgive the mistakes of the past, the bloodshed, the betrayal, and let go of the power it had held over her. She closed her eyes and whispered the words the stool had long been waiting to hear. "I forgive you." The air around her seemed to shimmer, and for a brief moment, she felt a lightness, a release from the heavy burden she had carried. The stool trembled, its golden surface flashing brightly, and then, in a single, resounding moment, the curse was broken. The spirits of the Ashanti ancestors, once bound by the stool's power, faded into the ether, their voices quieted. The weight of centuries of betrayal and regret lifted, and the land, the air, the very earth beneath her feet seemed to breathe again. Samantha collapsed to her knees, exhausted, but relieved. The curse was no more. She had broken the cycle. Kofi stood silently beside her, watching the transformation. He knew that the Ashanti legacy had been freed, and with it, a new chapter had begun, not just for the kingdom, but for the spirits of the ancestors, and for Samantha herself. Epilogue: a new beginning. Samantha left Ghana a different person than when she had arrived. The burden of the Ashanti curse had weighed heavily on her. But in the end, it was her ability to forgive not just the kings of the past, but herself that had allowed her to break it. She had found peace, both within herself and in the legacy of the Ashanti people. Though the golden stool remained in its rightful place, now a symbol of hope and unity rather than a vessel of power and destruction. Samantha knew that her journey was far from over. She would continue her work, her studies, and her understanding of the cultures that had shaped the world. But now, she did so with a new understanding that history, no matter how dark, could always be rewritten through the power of forgiveness and redemption. And as she walked away from the shrine, her heart light and her spirit free, Samantha knew that the past no longer had a hold over her. The curse was broken, and with it, a new chapter in the story of the Ashanti and of her own life had begun.